Let's talk about the superego. So, superego is a concept that Freud developed incredibly late in his theoretical unfolding. So, it comes not until 1923. So, it's almost the last major conceptual breakthrough that Freud makes, although there are some things that he will further elaborate on in the late 1920s and early 1930s. But really, I think the understanding of superego as a psychic force is the last major conceptual breakthrough. Now, what's interesting is Freud thought of superego as an internal aspect of subjectivity. So part of this tripartite division of the psyche, superego, ego, and id, which he developed later in his thought. What I think is fascinating about superego, and what Freud himself doesn't develop, but later psychoanalytic theorists have, is that superego really helps to explain a lot of social phenomena in their psychic underpinnings in a way that other psychoanalytic concepts don't. So, for instance, the concept of id, I don't think is that helpful for understanding why certain things are happening in society, politically, for instance. But I think superego is immensely helpful, as I'll try to lay out in the following few minutes. What does a Penrose staircase have to do with superego? Well, you never get anywhere. And it's the same thing. Walking up these stairs and trying to obey the superego, you never get to where you think you're trying to go. One of the main ways of understanding superego is as an internalization of the external law. So I've brought the external law into the psyche. And I think this is the common understanding of superego. I also think it's a common misunderstanding of superego. I think really superego has almost nothing, if anything at all, to do with external law. Here's how Freud himself puts it in his important essay, Neurosis and Psychosis. In undertaking the repression, the ego is at bottom following the commands of its superego, commands which in their turn originate from influences in the external world that have found representation in the superego. So the superego is commanding the ego. It's commanding the subject. That's, I think, one of the important ways to think about how superego functions. Now, Freud views it as an internal force that commands obedience. And Freud thinks obedience to the law on the part of the subject. Now, I think he's absolutely right to say that it commands obedience. I don't think that it's commanding obedience to the moral law or any kind of law. So what the superego does, it commands that the subject repress its desire. So there's an opposition between superego and desire. I think, although superego is also one of the ways in which desire finds its expression. So it's not just a vehicle of repression. Freud develops this concept of the superego, as I said, late in his thought, in 1923, in his important little book called The Ego and the Id. What I find fascinating about this title is the ego and the id, I think, are okay, they're somewhat important concepts, but superego is the real breakthrough concept, and he leaves it out of the title. So you could have just called the book, I think, The Superego, and left ego and id out of the title. But I think it's an instance where Freud himself underestimates the breakthrough that he makes with superego, thinking that ego and the id is where the real interest lies psychoanalytically, and I don't think that's the case. So here's the book, again, 1923. It's under 100 pages, very short book, Das Ich und das Es, the ego and the id. Earlier in his thought, and this gets developed in Interpretation of Dreams and of 1900 and in other works, Freud articulates what he will call the topographical model of the psyche, with the unconscious, the preconscious, and consciousness. Then in 1923, he'll articulate a structural model which supplements rather than replaces the older topographical model. And this is the model with id, ego, and superego. And interestingly, it's the one that's become more commonly associated with Freud. So I think I think in that sense, it's a more conformist model than the one emphasizing the unconscious. And which is not to say it's wrong. I just think it's more acceptable to people teaching psychology, for instance, because it fits in with other psychological models in a way that the idea of the unconscious doesn't really. Now, here's Freud's diagram that attempts to bring these two models together. So you see here unconscious and preconscious and the top perception consciousness function. And then you see how id, ego, and superego he sees written on top of that other model. So again, the models are not at odds with each other. They're supplementing each other, working together. And what's evident about this model is that the superego reaches down into the id for its strength. That's why it's on the side there, and you can see it coming all the way down into the id. So the point is, superego's ability to restrain desire, to repress desire, comes from our capacity to desire. So it's really the way in which we're desiring against ourselves, you might say, is what superego is doing, or the way in which we're enjoying against our form of enjoyment, something like that. That it's really, superego is where we're definitely at odds with ourself through the energy that comes from our own drive, our own id. Superego, as Freud will say in The Ego and the Id, the superego is always close to the id and can act as its representative vis-a-vis the ego. It reaches deep down into the id, and for that reason is farther from consciousness than the ego is. So even though we think, oh, I understand consciously what my moral system is, the superegoic part of my morality, if superego has anything to do with morality at all, which I think it doesn't, I think it's questionable, it's unconscious. So superego is fundamentally unconscious. It's as unconscious as id is. So the superego doesn't counter the id, but instead diverts the power of the id, or diverts our drive, our way of desiring, into a repressive apparatus. So it turns our own desire against us into repression. Now, Freud develops the idea of the superego. I think this is incredibly important just after his discovery of the death drive in 1920 in the book Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So I think that you can't imagine a concept of superego prior to death drive. So it's the discovery of death drive that allows Freud to then come up with this idea of superego. And the death drive is the subject's own self-destructiveness, its path of self-destruction, the way it cuts into itself. And you can see, I think, that sounds a lot like superego. It's very linked to superego. But what happens is the superego channels the destructiveness of the death drive into the framework of obedience. So it takes our self-destructiveness and allows it to work toward conformity or toward obedience. And I think one of the great filmmakers of superego is David Lynch, and he shows how the superego assaults the psyche, and he does this by representing superego through external figures. And in the film Lost Highway, the superegoic figure is the character Mr. Eddie, and we'll see him here performing a kind of a cop in a traffic stop, even though he's a criminal. He's a part of the mob underworld. Yet he's here acting like a cop and acting like he's concerned with law, but it's really the violence and the repressiveness of the gesture, the demand for obedience, that's crucial here. Let's take a look at this.
Don't you fucking tailgate! Ever! Tell him you won't tailgate.
Never!
I won't ever.
Do you know how many fucking car lengths it takes to stop a car at 35 miles an hour? 6 fucking car lengths! That's 106 fucking feet, mister! If I had to stop suddenly, you would have hit me! I want you to get a fucking driver's manual! I want you to study that motherfucker! And I want you to obey the goddamn rules! 50 fucking thousand people were killed on the highway last year because of fucking assholes like you! Tell me you're gonna get a manual!
So it's amazing. And what's great about this scene is that it shows that even though Mr. Eddie is telling him to obey the law, he's enjoying the violence of the command, right? Like that's the crucial aspect of this scene. And I think we wrongly associate superego with an agency of morality. And this is, I think, really, superego has nothing to do with morality. And Freud makes this mistake. So Freud links superego to the Kantian categorical imperative, the moral law itself. So Kant develops the moral law in the Critique of Practical Reason, first in the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, but then later in the Critique of Practical Reason gets it fully fleshed out. And what's interesting is for Freud, that's just Kant as a thinker of superego. But I think what's interesting is that Kant actually posits the categorical imperative as respite from the superego. So it's a way to free us from all the societal ways, the demands of conformity that are superegoic. So I think Freud miscalculates, perhaps because he wasn't a deep studier of Kant, perhaps he just didn't think Kant through fully enough, or the understanding of Kant at Freud's time wasn't sufficient. Whatever it is, he didn't see the way in which moral law actually could be an agency that frees us from superego. And one way to think about this is that the superego commands obedience to social demands, but not to the moral law. And the moral law is a way to get out of, if we obey the moral law, we don't conform to social demands. And I think that's the crucial insight. And one way to think about superego is to think that its fundamental command of the subject is the command to enjoy. And this is a point made by the thinker Jacques Lacan. And I think he really advanced the understanding of superego more than anyone, even more than Freud, who developed the idea. So Lacan says nothing forces anyone to enjoy except the superego. The superego is the imperative of jouissance, enjoy. Now, one of the things that follows from this is not that you really do enjoy when you're following the imperative of the superego. One of the ways to make sure that someone doesn't enjoy themselves is to command them to do it. I often think that commanding one to enjoy is a lot like commanding yourself to go to sleep. It's the surest way to have insomnia, right? So the command to enjoy is really the way to structure a barrier to enjoyment, even though the command is that you enjoy. And I think that this function of superego as a command to enjoy becomes most evident when authorities are insistent that we just go our own way. And this kind of authority figure gets best illustrated, best ever, I think, in the film Dead Poets Society. So Mr. Keating, played by Robin Williams, is to me an utter figure of superego. And people that love Dead Poets Society, I think, are in a certain way in love with the figure of the superego that will tell us what to do and thus free us from our own desire.
And we all have a great need for acceptance. But you must trust that your beliefs are unique, your own, even though others may think them odd or unpopular, even though the herd may go, that's bad. Robert Frost said, 2 roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. I want you to find your own walk right now, your own way of striding, pacing, any direction, anything you want, whether it's proud, whether it's silly, anything.
So it seems great, right? Mr. Keating says, Don't follow, take the road less taken. By the way, that's a terrible reading of the Robert Frost poem, The Road Less Taken, or The Road Not Taken. What's interesting is he's commanding them to go their own way, enjoy themselves in their own way. So it's an interesting command because there's really no way out of it, right? Like to disobey, and one character even decides not to walk, and he says, I'm exercising my right not to walk, and Keating says, you just proved the point. So there's no way to get out of this structure. Once you're within this logic of the superego, once you succumb to it a little bit, once you allow this figure to be erected, and once you start to capitulate to it, you're stuck. One of the most horrific ways in which the logic of the superego socially manifested itself was in acts of lynching. So lynching, the lynching party, is a way in which everyone in the society, everyone in white Southern society, comes together in America, comes together to conform, even though they're breaking the law. So they usually would break a figure out of prison or abduct the person, whatever they would do. But they would never follow the law. So it's crucial that lynching, and I think this is why it's an important instance of superegoic pressure. Everyone comes together to do it. Everyone in white society comes together to do it. And yet, it's not following the law. It's breaking the law. So I think that this is, for me, this is the crucial instance of where our understanding of superego can make sense of an event, a horrific event like lynching, and what drives it. That this conformity driven by the figure of the superego for all these people that are joining in. And the logic of the superego is such that the more one gives in, the less return one receives. So the more you obey, the less you feel like you are obeying, the more you feel increasing pressure to obey. So it's not like I obey a little bit and then superego is satisfied. No, if I obey a little bit, it demands a lot. Or one can never obey the superegoic command enough. So the more you capitulate, the more is asked of you. To me, dieting is a great instance of how superegoic logic works, how this losing game of the superegoic imperative plays out. So we get this nice command, eat right, and superegoic command for sure, if there ever was one. And let's follow the logic out. So first, I decide to cut out saturated fat in order to reduce the risk of heart problems and colon cancer that run in my family. This is relatively true for me, by the way. Then I reduce sugar to avoid diabetes, which also runs in my family. I have to give up all these great things on the right. After that, I try to avoid gluten because I learned that I have a gluten sensitivity. So now you see my possibilities are narrowing quite a bit. Subsequently, my doctor says I need to eliminate dairy products because I have an allergic reaction to them as well. But then the problem is my protein levels start to sag, so I have to find an additional protein source, and that probably contains saturated fat, and it brings me back to the initial problem. So you see, the more I follow the logic, the more it asks of me, and the logic itself is contradictory. So I can never solve the problem that the superego sets out for me to solve because it doesn't want me to solve it. It wants me to create more of a problem. And the diet as such obeys this logic of the superego that never ever relents in its injunction to the subject. So it's demanding something of the subject. And the point is not what it demands, but the demand itself. So again, the point is the form that the superego takes, not the content of its imperative, the content of its command. That's meaningless. That's why you can't obey it. The enjoyment of the superego comes through the form, and that's what's unrelenting. And superegoic acts require a renunciation on the part of the subject. That's what superego is trying to get the subject to make some fundamental renunciation. And it's the source of the little enjoyment that the superego actually supplies. So I said before, that the command to enjoy actually makes it more difficult to enjoy. But there is a little enjoyment that the superego gives through the renunciation that it demands. So by giving up something, giving up all those different foods, I get some superegoic enjoyment of dieting. So in the case of dieting, I never achieved the perfect body that I seemed to want to target that would embody perfect enjoyment. But I'm able to enjoy all these renunciations. So I enjoy the cake and not eating it. I enjoy the dairy products and not consuming them, right? So all these aspects of my diet furnish me with enjoyment insofar as they require renunciation. You might say that superegoic enjoyment is the enjoyment of an obedient renunciation. A lot of renunciations are not obedient, but superegoic renunciations are. As Slavoj Žižek puts it, superego draws the energy of the pressure it exerts on the subject from the fact that the subject was not faithful to its desire, that it gave it up. Our sacrificing to the superego, our paying tribute to it, only corroborates our guilt. So the fact that you've sacrificed your desire is what erects the superego and its power of the imperative in the first place. So the more you sacrifice your desire for the superego, the more you feed the figure of superego. And I think this nicely gets illustrated in Jean Renoir's Rules of the Game, which the entire film, I think one could argue, is one of the great explorations of the power of superego in keeping everyone in line. And we can see this here. This is Andre and Christine, and Andre is having an affair with Christine and wants to run off with her. And we'll see now how superego actually gets in the way of him following this desire.
Eh bien, on va s'en aller, André.
Mais où?
N'importe où.
Et quand?
Mais tout de suite.
Oh, je vous aime, Christine. Je crois que je saurais vous rendre heureuse. Depuis des mois, je pense tellement à ce que je ferais si j'avais le bonheur d'être avec vous. Alors, je sais très bien. Enfin, je veux dire, ce bonheur ne me prend pas au dépourvu. N'ayez pas peur, Christine. Il faut que j'aille prévenir la chaînée.
Pourquoi faire?
Mais Christine, parce que ça se fait.
So Andre has to go tell Christine's husband that he's taking her away because why? Ça se fait. That's what's done. That's done. All right. So that's the dictate of the superego. That's just what's done. And it ends up being the barrier to Christine and Andre going away at all. Right. Like they don't end up together at the end of the film. Why not? Because of the power of superego and its rule over the character of Andre. And this giving in to the superego is actually a capitulation to social authority or the big other rather than an insistence on one's own form of enjoyment. So that's the thing, that it's a social capitulation that comes at the expense of one's own subjectivity and the uniqueness, the singularity of one's own subjectivity. And what's fascinating is that the effect of superego doesn't just destroy the singularity of the subject, but it also has a deleterious effect on society as a whole. So it also, capitulation of the superego doesn't help society. It actually creates a much more violent and aggressive society. So superego is not this figure, again, not this source of morality that will help society function better. Actually, it's a force for immorality, this is why I linked it to lynching and even in this, even what we see in Rules of the Game, that the force of superego is not helping the society get run better. And superegoic pressure, I think, is one of the primary motivating forces for reactionary politics. So the enjoyment of the superego is reactionary political enjoyment. what happens? The superego leads subjects to attempt to destroy those who they believe stand in the way of some unrestrained enjoyment. And this is an enjoyment we associate with what? With the nation, with the ethnic group, with a certain religion. And this enjoyment is what we could have if it were not for this other standing in the way, which has to be destroyed. So whatever this is, if it's communism, right? If it's critical race theory, whatever it is, this is the barrier that the superego says you have to destroy so you can get this ultimate enjoyment. But the enjoyment, remember, of superego comes from the act of destruction. So it's a conformist violence, a conformist destruction that the right is employing. And right-wing populism is and depends on this superegoic pressure and the enjoyable violence that it produces. And you can imagine here, I think, Donald Trump shouting out some command like enjoy, beat those guys up, or, enjoy in that way, here as president. So superego pressures subjects to adhere to the dictates of, like what Trump is here, a primal father figure who is the populist leader. So not a figure of the social law, but instead a primal father figure who's saying, enjoy, enjoy, enjoy. That's the constant dictate. Not restrain your enjoyment like a figure of the law says. So the populist right offers this enjoyment of obedience to the superegoic imperative that commands one to transgress the law, which is why it shouldn't be surprising that the populist right ends up trying to overthrow the legal structure, the political structure in the United States. So the insurrection is just a extension of this superegoic imperative. And I think, again, this shows nicely the contrast, the distance between morality and superego. So superego is commanding one to do something that violates the law, that violates all morality, but that's the enjoyment that it produces through that transgression and violation. So what happens when one obeys the superego, I think, is that one turns the death drive, which is the path of freedom, the path of the subject's own singularity. Its death drive is its own forging of singularity. But it turns this into the site of obedience. And this is, I think, the fundamental logic that happens with superego that I think Freud doesn't quite get. And I think Lacan doesn't quite get to this point, that what happens is that superego diverts death drive from freedom into obedience. And that's the fundamental structure, the logic at work in superego. So one of the times where we can see superego perhaps most at work is when a traffic stop occurs, right? Like there's nothing you can do, especially if you're a black motorist, in the face of a white cop coming up to you. But even if you're a white motorist, you still can feel disarmed by this figure of the law. But I think I like, there's a nice little joke about a traffic stop that is good because it shows the way in which it flips the thing around so that it's not the figure of the law that's acting superegoically relative to the motorist, but the motorist who acts as the force of the superego relative to the cop. The joke goes like this. So a cop sees a motorist weaving around the road, pulls him over, comes up to him and says, "Look, I saw you weaving. You got to come down to the station and breathe in our breathalyzer." The driver's like, I can't do that because I'm asthmatic, and if I breathe out too deeply, I'll have an asthma attack. The cop's like, "Okay, no problem. We'll just do a blood draw and take your blood." The guy's like, "Well, the problem is that I'm a hemophiliac, and so if I have blood taken out, my red blood cells will get too low, and I'll have all kinds of problems. The cop's like, okay, no worries. We'll do a urine test. And the driver says, again, he's like, sorry, but I'm diabetic. So if I urinate too much, then my blood sugar gets too low, causes the problem. The cop's like, all right, well, just stand out of the car and walk this straight line. And the guy's like, I can't, I'm drunk. Okay, so what's great about this joke is it flips around the working of superego. So it's not the cop that's the figure of the superego. It's the drunk driver who thwarts every move the cop makes to try to test his drunkenness, his state of drunkenness or state of inebriation. So I think, to me, it's a perfect superegoic joke precisely because of this reversal, that we can see the way in which superego is actually opposed to law. And I think once you understand that superego is not an extension of law, but an opposition, it functions in opposition to law, then I think you can start to see how superego can be deployed as a way to understanding how society's working.